Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we will resume with the continuation of Thousand Autumns, Volume 1, also known as Tian Qiu by Meng Xi Shi. We will be reading chapters 23 through 26. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 23, Gentleness. Shun Xiao felt like he'd been asleep for a very long time, but he wasn't entirely unconscious in his stupor. He could at least hear when a person spoke loudly into his ear or when the wheels of a carriage rumbled on beneath him. He still held on to some awareness. Although he was insensate, his true qi never stopped circulating for a moment. The benefits of training with the Juyang strategy became apparent now. Although he wasn't aware of it, his body was repairing itself bit by bit. Though these bodily repairs progressed at a terribly slow speed, by the time Shun Qiao regained his consciousness, the stifling pain and desire to vomit had vanished. But after sleeping for so many days, he woke into a trance-like state, as if he'd fallen into a dream. He held his head, expression perplexed. Looking around, he realized that he was probably inside a carriage. It was stopped, though, and he didn't know where. Shun Qiao carefully thought back and recalled that he'd fought with Yan Wushi before he fainted. Then Yan Wushi must have brought him away somewhere. As he was racking his brain, the carriage curtain lifted with a rustle. Shun Qiao looked up automatically. Awake? The one word set all the hair on Shun Qiao's body on end. Shun Qiao couldn't claim to have any sort of deep relationship with Yan Wushi, but he did have some understanding of the man's temperament and way of doing things. But now, were it not that his face and voice were unchanged, Shun Qiao would have thought Yan Wushi was possessed by a ghost. When had the demon lord, whose very name inspired dread, who was disagreeable and volatile, who reveled in mocking sarcasm, learned to use such a gentle voice, bone deep with tenderness? Shun Qiao hesitated, then he said, "Sect Leader Yan, did something happen?" "Your injuries were serious," said Yan Wushi, "and you were unconscious for many days. Fortunately, the Juyang strategy's true qi is working, and it's protecting your vital meridians. After a couple more days of rest, you should be fine. We've just entered Ying province. I found us an inn to stay at. Come." He bent at the waist, then picked Shun Qiao up in his arms like a princess. Shun Qiao was absolutely appalled. He longed to turn and run, but as he'd just woken up from a days-long sleep, he was too weak to struggle. All he could do was go along with it. Yan Wushi had a gentle smile on his face. Shun Qiao looked like he'd seen a ghost, but Yan Wushi ignored this and carried him into the inn, and then walked further, the entire way from the lounge to the courtyard, allowing others to crowd around and watch them. Even the inn's concierge kept looking back while he led the way, but Yan Wushi continued on, showing no concern. "Just to let the two gentlemen know, this isn't just the most beautiful courtyard in our inn, but in the entirety of this Ying province city. Take a look at the potted bonsai, the flowing streams. It's as luxurious as a wealthy family's courtyard. If you want to enjoy some spring scenery, you need not to trek to the outskirts and climb the hills. This courtyard has all the spring scenery our city has to offer." The concierge was eloquent, with a silver tongue, but Shun Qiao could neither see nor appreciate the beauty he was describing, though he could guess from the man's attitude that it must have cost a considerable amount to rent this courtyard. On the other hand, Yan Wushi seemed quite interested. Not only did he let the concierge run through the entire introduction without telling him to shut up, but he even offered a comment or two, which further fueled the guide's exuberance. He prattled on, introducing every little detail of the place. All this time, Yan Wushi was carrying a grown man in his arms, and yet he strolled through the courtyard, not flagging in the slightest. The concierge's reverence grew greater all the while. Shun Qiao sorely needed to rest his aching body. He'd slept for so long and had only been awake for a short while, yet he could already feel the onset of fatigue. He almost fell asleep right there in Yan Wushi's arms. After a long while, the concierge finally came to his senses and left. Yan Wushi brought Shun Qiao into the sleeping quarters and laid him down on a bamboo cot next to the window. The cot was covered with a thick, soft wool blanket. The moment he lay down, Shun Qiao felt his bones groan in comfort. But Yan Wushi didn't rush to leave. Instead, he sat down right beside him. Did Sect Leader Yan rent a courtyard with only one bedroom? Shun Qiao asked. Yan Wushi was completely unruffled. Of course not. But I rented the courtyard, so I can sit wherever I please. You've been unconscious for days, and I've taken care of you for the entire journey. But instead of thanking me, you've been acting all evasive. Was the sect leader of Shrendu Mountain brought up with such rude manners? Shen Qiao thought to himself, my manner is evasive because yours is abnormal. He'd only just thought this when Yan Wushi suddenly reached over and straightened his muscled collar. Shen Qiao jolted, this time not even in astonishment, but terror. It was simply unbelievable that he'd gone to sleep and then woken up to Yan Wushi switching personalities entirely. For the life of him, Shen Qiao couldn't figure out what this man was up to. Please stop making fun of me, Sect Leader Yan. How could you say I'm making fun of you? Asked Yan Wushi. Do you know how many Huanyue sect disciples wish that I'd be this pleasant to them? Let alone others. It's very rare that I'm this nice to anyone. Most people wouldn't get this kind of treatment even if they begged for it. The corner of Shen Qiao's mouth twisted. Did this humble Shun unintentionally offend Sect Leader Yan in his stupor without realizing? If that's the case, this Shun will make amends to Sect Leader Yan, and he asks Sect Leader Yan to be generous, to not hold it against a blind man. Yan Wushi burst out laughing. Shun Qiao. Some have called you honest and generous, but I don't think that's necessarily true. What sort of honest man throws around his blindness all the time just to shut people up? Shun Qiao pressed his lips together and said nothing. Shun Qiao shuddered faintly when Yan Wushi placed 3 fingers on his pulse. It was unclear if he hadn't been able to avoid him or if he hadn't bothered to. You still can't see? Shun Qiao nodded. Perhaps it's because I exhausted my true qi before passing out. The area around my eyes feels warm, so it will probably take some time yet. No rush, said Yan Wushi. There's still a long way to Northern Zhou, and we'll be taking a carriage for the journey. You can take your time recuperating. Shun Qiao frowned. Northern Zhou? What, you don't want to go? It was a purely rhetorical question. From their sex to their pasts, to their personalities, and even their conduct, the two of them had nothing in common. Yan Wushi's pride was so great that he could never fathom how Shun Qiao remained so calm despite falling into such awful straits. Not to mention, with the way Shun Qiao was being forced to parade through the streets, someone would eventually recognize him as the former Shrendu Mountain sect leader. That would certainly attract a great deal of gossip. There would always be someone around to remind Shun Qiao again and again of the experiences he'd rather not be reminded of. He'd been the mighty and honored leader of the world's #1 Taoist sect, but he'd lost his martial arts and position and was betrayed by his own Shirdi. Everything he'd protected so carefully had been deemed worthless, and everyone thought his decisions were wrong. Everything he'd believed in since childhood had been overturned. And what was worse, he still couldn't see, and day and night made no difference to him at all. In an unfamiliar environment, a few extra steps would be enough to trip him, not to mention the difficulties he ran into with small things like getting up, washing and dressing himself in the morning. It was these sorts of everyday details, not facing enemies with only the aid of his hearing, that could weigh someone down with bone-deep frustration. Yan Wushi found it extremely hard to understand such a defeated mentality, and he had no interest in trying. What interested him was Shun Qiao himself. Even someone from the Jianghu who lost all their martial arts and went from a person who held life and death in their hands to a weakling who other people walked all over would be, at the very least, panicked, anxious, and depressed. That is, if they didn't lose themselves to hysteria. So how did this person, who looked so gentle and soft, manage to keep his composure at a time like this? Just what was he made of? Shun Qiao nodded. I'm afraid I'll drag down Sect Leader Yan's pace on this journey once again. I'm truly sorry. Yan Wushi had thought Shen Chao would simply say no or raise objections about going to Northern Zhou. The sheer meekness of his reply caught him by surprise. You could go back to Xuandu Mountain instead, he said insincerely. Settle down in Xuandu Town. Look for a chance to meet with your martial siblings or elders. Maybe they think differently than you, I. Maybe they'll support your return as sect leader. Though he clearly understood that Yan Wushi's words were meant to get a rise out of him, Shen Chao shook his head as before and answered his question. My martial arts aren't good enough yet, and even if I did return, I wouldn't have the face to leave Xuandu Mountain after losing to Kunye. Besides, Yu Ai is already the acting sect leader, so we must have complete control over what the sect says and does. If I go back, I could even be forced to do their bidding. It's better for me to stay far away. Maybe that way I can see some things more clearly. Thinking this over, he smiled. Didn't Sect Leader Yan once say that I was ignorant of everyday things and people's intentions? And that's how I ended up in this situation? You hold an important position in Northern Zhou. If I follow Sect Leader Yan there, I can learn many things, and that will prevent me from making more missteps and repeating the errors of my past. So, this is a blessing for me. You're not concerned about Ui working with the Gok Turks? Yan Wushi raised an eyebrow. Shen Chao shook his head. There is something very strange there. I trust that Sect Leader Yan has noticed it too. After Hulugu left in defeat, there's been no news of him for 20 years. Kunye re-entered the Jianghu on his master's orders, and I'm certain the reason wasn't as simple as challenging me to a duel. Him working with Ui must have a deeper scheme buried within it as well. I heard that Sect Leader Yan has fought with Kunye. Did your esteemed self find him a reckless person? Yan Wushi spoke plainly. His aptitude isn't bad. Given enough time, he might become another Hulugu. He couldn't have defeated me, even with his full strength, but it was obvious that he was holding back. I don't know why he didn't put his full effort in, so I toyed with him for several rounds, and it was the same thing every time. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He ran back to the Kaganate. The implication was, if Kunye really was a reckless person, he wouldn't have been able to stomach holding back for too long, for so many rounds, even if he knew he couldn't win. Shen Chao frowned a bit in thought. Many things had started to connect. A vague logic began to make itself known, but so far, this logic remained unclear. It was like an enormous, confused mass of tangled string. He still couldn't find the end of it, so the overall shape was still bewildering. He sighed. It looks like it's just like Sect Leader Yan said. I know very little about what's going on in the world. I was down in as well, watching the sky, secluded and unmoving. I, too, am responsible for what Ui is doing, though I can't even guess what they're planning. Yan Wushi sneered. Where did all this sentimentality come from? One strong man can crush 10 skilled ones. If you're strong enough, you can simply slaughter them all. Those people betrayed you, so they must brace themselves for payback. Unless you plan on forgiving them once you understand their intentions. Shen Chao didn't know what to do with this just kill them attitude. According to you, in order for Ui to control Xuandu Mountain, my martial siblings and the elders of Xuandu's Violet Palace must have tacitly approved of his overtake. Even my kind-hearted Da Shishong must also believe that Ui is 100 times better as a sect leader than I was. Does that mean I'll have to kill them all too? Those people are the pillars of Xuandu Mountain. If they're gone, how much sect would even be left? Even if your martial arts do return, and you regain your position as sect leader, you and those martial siblings of yours can never go back to the way it was in the past, Yan Wushi said, full of malice. The memory of their betrayal will be lodged inside you like a fishbone in your throat, never changing. And as for them, would they ever truly believe you'd forgiven them? As he spoke, he moved closer to Shen Chao until his warm breath fanned out right between them. Faintly uncomfortable, Shen Chao canted his head away. Everyone holds evil thoughts inside their hearts. The difference lies in whether or not they act on it. Why castigate them for being human? But Yan Wushi replied, Oh, You hold evil thoughts inside your heart too, do you? What are your evil thoughts, pray tell? Shun Qiao tried to back away, but was arrested by an arm on his waist, forcing him to slightly arch his back. Without him knowing it was happening, he'd been backed into a corner, his shoulders pressed tightly against the wall. A painting must be hung behind him. He could feel the tube digging painfully into his back. Ah, Qiao, what are your evil thoughts? Let me hear. Hearing Yan Wushi call him Ah Qiao sent goosebumps rising all over his body. But before his astonishment could show on his face, Shun Qiao was already bewitched, falling into a trance brought on by that low voice. He opened his mouth to answer, I. Rap, rap, rap! From outside came the sound of knocking. Shun Qiao jolted, coming to his senses at once. You used the charm technique? He asked. It's called demonic persuasion. Huanyue sect is one of the 3 branches of the Ruyue sect, too. So, naturally, whatever He Huan sect knows, I know. That little girl Bairong's technique is far from perfect. If you hear it a couple more times, you won't fall for her tricks too easily in the future. Even with his ploy exposed, Yan Wushi didn't show the slightest hint of shame. Instead, his tone was arrogant enough to suggest Shun Qiao should be honored that the venerable Yan Wushi had employed such a technique on him. Shun Qiao was a modest gentleman. He didn't have it in him to argue against Yan Wushi's sophistry. He was irritated, but found it comical too. So, sect leader Yan is saying that I should thank him? Said Yan Wushi. You should thank me. Chapter 24. The Powers of the World. The concierge entered, bowls full of food and soup in hand. Sir, this is the medicine we brewed according to the prescription you wrote. The kitchen has also prepared some lotus seed syrup and a couple of desserts for your 2 honored selves to allay your hunger with. Once it's mealtime, we'll send some other dishes over for the main course. It should have been a pharmacy's job to fill prescriptions and brew the medicine. But once Yan Wushi offered enough money, practically raining gold down on them from the heavens, the inn took him as the god of wealth and served him diligently. They put all their effort into fawning over him. Yan Wushi took the bowl of medicine and said to Shun Qiao, You need to recuperate from your injuries, and medicine will help with that process. Here, I'll feed you. Shun Qiao and the concierge were both rendered speechless. Here was the face that oozed arrogance and conceit, saying words that came out gentle as water. It was categorically incongruous. The concierge didn't know that they'd just had a confrontation. When he heard Yan Wushi's tone, so tender it practically dripped, he froze. The gentleman looked a little frail and sickly, but he was still a man. Could the 2 of them be cut sleeves? The concierge couldn't help but shudder. Shun Qiao was now truly afraid of Yan Wushi. He had no idea what he was trying to play at. A mere moment before, Yan Wushi had been trying to force out his evil thoughts using demonic techniques. Then in the next moment, in front of this outsider, his attitude had done a 180. The sheer speed of the change was unbelievable. Yan Wushi ignored both of their reactions and stared unswervingly at Shun Qiao. His tone grew even gentler. Don't be afraid. I've already cooled the medicine for you by blowing on it. It's not hot anymore. Arduously, Shun Qiao spat out a couple of words. Sect leader Yan. Then a spoon was stuffed into his mouth, and the medicine's bitterness exploded across his tongue. Unable to open his mouth, he was forced to swallow the brew. Yan Wushi followed up with spoon after spoon, and in the blink of an eye, he'd fed Shun Qiao half the bowl. The entire time, his gaze was attentive and careful, and he wore a soft smile as if he looked upon something beloved. Shun Qiao couldn't see Yan Wushi's expression, but the concierge could. He felt all the hair on his body stand straight up. If he lingered in the room, he thought to himself, that cut-sleeve gentleman might even take a liking to him, and then tell the boss that he wanted him. Then what would he do? He put the food down in a hurry and smiled apologetically. Please enjoy the meal, gentlemen. This lowly one will leave now. If your honored selves have need of anything else, just ring the bell again. Yan Wushi made a sound in response, but didn't turn his head. The concierge sighed in relief, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and then quickly slipped away. The moment he left, Yan Wushi shoved the bowl into Shun Chao's hands. Drink it yourself. Shun Chao was speechless once again. From the smell of it, he gathered that the bowl of medicine was full of herbs that nourished the qi and enriched the blood. But Yan Wusher's attitude reversals, one after the other, were too bizarre. He had to ask, Sect Leader Yan, was there something suspicious about the concierge? No. Then why? Yan Wusher laughed. What? Don't tell me that you got addicted to being fed. You want this venerable one to finish spoon feeding you the rest of the bowl? Shun Chao didn't bother replying. Yan Wushi cupped his chin. Actually, now that I see you like this, your face isn't too bad. All disciples of the Noble Discipline's 3 branches practice charm techniques to augment their good looks. If you weren't so sickly all the time, you'd look better than all of them. Being toyed with like this when he was seriously injured was one thing, since he wasn't able to resist anyway. But at that moment, Shun Chao was clear-headed. He couldn't help but strain his neck back, brushing Yan Wusher's hand away at the same time. Yan Wusher let go smoothly and didn't force the issue. Have you ever heard of the lip cup? Yan Wusher asked. What's that? His tone was so serious that Shun Chao didn't suspect a thing. Yan Wusher smiled. When brothels feed their customers mouth to mouth, that's called a lip cup. This venerable one can feed you your medicine that way, if you wish. Shun Chao was an upright gentleman. He'd always kept himself proper, his heart pure and free of desires. He'd never heard words like these, verging on the obscene. He immediately pressed his lips together and refused to speak, but against his will, a faint flush spread over his stark white face. It wasn't out of shyness. He was just a little frustrated. Yan Wusher had gotten his fill of messing around. When he saw Shun Chao's face change, he burst out laughing. It looked like he found Shun Chao incredibly amusing. Shun Chao's expression took on a touch of outrage. After that, Yan Wusher seemed to develop some strange proclivities. It was almost like he'd gotten hooked on toying with Shun Chao. He was always wanting to put on a show in public so that he could watch Shun Chao's various reactions. Shun Chao was good-natured and strong-willed. After the first few times, he could already keep a straight face despite the assorted lewd words and biting comments. And yet, not only did Yan Wusher fail to get bored, he even redoubled his efforts, as if determined to find Shun Chao's absolute limit. Fortunately, although Yan Wusher had asked Shun Chao to travel with him, he didn't restrict Shun Chao's freedom. It was, of course, inconvenient for Shun Chao to go anywhere on his own, so most of the time he stayed obediently inside his room. He'd sit by the window, listening to the rattling of wind and rain, the rustling of the trees and branches, and not give anyone trouble. But there were occasional exceptions. The inn was large, with many people coming and going, and they weren't only merchants and officials. It was also one of the largest inns in that Ying province city, so it was a prime location for gathering news. Yan Wusher didn't just choose it because it was the city's most beautiful courtyard. During this time period, inns and relay stations were divided into public halls and private rooms, and the latter were further separated into large rooms and small rooms. Small rooms were reserved for groups of a few people to discuss private matters, while the large ones were for attracting business, to draw customers to the inn. These larger rooms were categorized according to occupation: scholars, farmers, artisans, merchants, and so forth. If you were a merchant, you could take the initiative to ask for a private room in an area with mainly merchants. Even if no one knew each other beforehand, they might become acquainted by eating a meal together. Then they could even expand their networks, discussing some business, enjoying their work and meal at the same time. The same held true for scholars and martial artists. And, of course, there were the merchants who pretended to be scholars. They'd insist on joining in on the scholars' conversations, but mostly they ended up a laughingstock. In general, People wouldn't jump to embarrass themselves for no reason like that. Yan Wushi should have counted as a martial artist, but he also had another identity he could use in Ying province, which was inside northern Zhou. If he were to broadcast his official position as the junior preceptor of the crown prince, Ying province officials would probably crowd around to kiss up to him. But oddly, Yan Wushi chose neither of these. Instead, he selected a room for merchants and brought Shen Qiao there. By now, Shen Qiao was already used to being in the dark. With Yan Wushi leading the way, he slowly followed behind with his bamboo cane. He didn't need anyone's support, but Yan Wushi insisted on holding his wrist, which made the whole thing look deeply intimate. Since Shen Qiao wasn't able to pull his hand back, he just let Yan Wushi have his way. Ever since arriving in this Ying province city, Yan Wushi treated Shen Qiao with the utmost tenderness as long as other people were present. Nobody around knew the details of their relationship. When they saw the two of them, and especially when they saw the intimate way Yan Wushi looked at him, they simply assumed that Shen Qiao was some kind of kept man. They'd never seen a blind one, though, so now when the two of them walked into the merchant's dining room, everyone was greatly interested in the strange sight. Every eye in the room latched onto Shen Qiao. The two of them sat down at the same table. Yan Wushi declined when the waiter approached and personally set the bowl and chopsticks before Shen Qiao. Then he took Shen Qiao's hand and showed him where each dish was, one by one, describing what food was where. If anyone from Huanyue's sect could see him acting so considerately, they wouldn't dare to say it was really Yan Wushi. Just a few days ago, Shen Qiao would have been thoroughly uncomfortable, but given enough time, even goosebumps fade. He accepted the chopsticks without a change in expression, said a word of thanks, then lowered his head and slowly began to try the food. Seeing that they were acting as if no one was around, the crowd gradually lost interest. After thinking a couple of judgmental comments, they returned to their original topic of conversation. All the merchants in the room roamed the land extensively. They didn't necessarily know each other, but everyone who ate in this dining room had come there seeking to make connections. And, of course, merchants were resourceful by nature. Within a couple of exchanges, the atmosphere became lively once again. Someone said, "I heard that the Lord of Zhou intends to invade southward into Chun. Is that true? If some kind of friend here is well informed, please enlighten me. The last few years, this junior has traveled frequently between the north and the south, so I should make preparations early, lest I lose not only my goods, but my life." Goods are a small matter, but lives are a large one. Quite a few people heard him speak up, and they immediately echoed, "True, true." Another person asked him, "Shuralang, where did you get this information?" Shuralang said, "I heard it from my relative. He works in our honored governor's manor doing odd jobs, so it should be reliable." Another person said, "I heard the same thing, so I think there's a 9 out of 10 chance it's true. Think about it. Ever since His Majesty of Zhou gained his rightful place, he's been very ambitious and put all his efforts into governance. Nowadays, the south is rich and populous, and Chun's land is vast. If the Emperor of Zhou wants to unify the lands, he absolutely must take Chun first." "I disagree," someone immediately retorted. 2 years ago, during the northern expedition of Taijian, Chun allied with Zhou against Qi. This was only a short while ago. You're saying that Zhou will cast aside the alliance and attack Chun instead? If that's true, that's awfully unjust of them. The entire world will hold them in contempt. Ha! What a farce. What's so unjust? We're all businessmen here, and we need to consider how our profits are doing. How much is justice worth? Can you eat it? Everyone was talking at once, and a fight was clearly about to erupt. Xu Erlang quickly tried to smooth things over. "Calm down, everyone, calm down. As businessmen, we must remember that amiability is the key to prosperity. All these military and state issues are for the heavyweights of the world to worry about. What's it got to do with us? We're only concerned about where the fighting will be and when it'll start. His interruption relieved the awkward atmosphere of confrontation from the room, and they sat back down to eat and drink. A casually dressed man in the dining room, southern in appearance, finally broke his silence and spoke up then. In my opinion, all of your speculation is flawed. If the Lord of Zhou wishes to deploy his troops, his first choice definitely won't be the Chun dynasty. If you wish to travel back and forth between Chun and Zhou on business, it should be safe for the time being. The others asked, "How do you know?" The man said, "People will always pick the softest persimmon. They'll target the weakest. Qi is much softer than Chun. And if not Qi, then the Gokturks. In short, for the moment, the Lord of Zhou won't rush to send his troops out against the Chun dynasty." Shen Qiao placed his chopsticks down on the table. He straightened as he listened, his expression one of rapt attention. He'd once stood at the top of his sect, at the summit of the Taoist discipline, but that had been on a secluded, isolated Xuandu mountain. Since he'd also never thought to inquire about world affairs, his knowledge was limited, far more than that of these merchants who roamed so extensively. This particular shortcoming of his had become apparent after he left the sect, as he himself understood very well. So, whenever he heard others discussing affairs of state, he put his all into listening. Chapter 25. The Gokturks? Someone asked curiously. Why would the Lord of Zhou attack the Gokturks? Why ignore the affluent Central Plains in favor of the godforsaken land of the Gokturks? The man replied, "While the Central Plains launch non-stop military campaigns, the Gokturk people are expanding in the north as well. They've even defeated the powerful Persian Empire. The kingdoms of the Central Plains are rich in natural resources and full of talented people. Given the Gokturks' ambitions, how could they forego such a prime target? These days, with Taspar Kagan in power, the Gokturks are stronger than ever. Their arrogance and strength drive their aspirations even higher. If they wish to invade the Central Plains, the first to bear the brunt will be Qi and Zhou. Compared to northern Zhou, Qi's power is in decline. They're the perfect target, and the Gokturks are a thorn in their side. If the Lord of Zhou is a wise ruler, he won't pass up these two great opportunities. In comparison, the Chun dynasty would have to take a back seat, not to mention that the great Chun isn't easy pickings. If Yuan Yong wants to send his troops south into Chun, it won't just happen because he says so. All of you are worrying too much." "This gentleman does have a point," everyone whispered to one another. This gentleman said Great Chun. "Are you from the Chun dynasty?" Someone then asked. "I am." The man didn't hide it. Another person said, "This gentleman's manner doesn't seem like that of a typical merchant, but more like a scholar. This is mostly a gathering for merchants, so we fear that we may be unworthy of this gentleman's presence." The man coughed lightly. "I'm neither a scholar nor a merchant. I'm only here to join in the excitement." Just before, he'd spoken with ease and confidence, his back as straight as pine. Everyone here was a well-traveled merchant, so they could certainly tell that his mannerisms were from a powerful, noble family. But since the man was unwilling to say anything more, they didn't press him on the topic and turned instead to Zhou's local customs and practices. Shen Qiao had been struck by his speech and sank into contemplation. When he returned to himself, he realized that he'd unknowingly opened his mouth to receive the vegetarian goose Yan Wushi was feeding him. "Ah, Qiao, is it good?" Yan Wushi asked affectionately. Shen Qiao was unable to form a reply. It was too unsightly to spit out what was already in his mouth, so all he could do was swallow arduously, his expression twisting a little. If Shen Qiao hadn't possessed a fair understanding of him, he would have thought Yan Wushi really did want him for a kept man. But in truth, Yan Wushi was only acting on a whim for the fun of watching Shen Qiao squirm. It was just like back when he'd incidentally saved Shen Qiao beneath Banbu Peak. Yan Wushi was nowhere near a good person. He never saved other people for the simple joy of saving them. Someone else might be at ease, thinking that this was the way it should be, that they didn't owe each other anything. But Shen Qiao was gentle and refined in nature, an upright and virtuous man. He did also feel that Yan Wushi had done him a favor. For regardless of what the other's original intentions were, Shen Qiao had greatly benefited from being saved. So, as long as Yan Wushi didn't do something horrifically immoral, Shen Qiao would let him do as he wished and not hold anything against him. And it was precisely because Shen Qiao had such character that Yan Wushi wanted to toy with him repeatedly, that he was always trying to get a rise out of him. Every time he caught Shen Qiao getting upset, his mood would grow a few ticks better. After being tricked once, Shen Qiao absolutely refused to open his mouth when Yan Wushi approached with another spoonful of soup. Nobody else there knew the details. They only saw a man trying to feed the other who refused, and they took this as a confirmation of their relationship. Male cut sleeves had been common since the Wei and Jin dynasties, but it wasn't anything novel. Merchants themselves were well versed and knowledgeable in the ways of the world, so even though they were a little shocked at how shameless the two were acting in public, they didn't make a fuss. Shen Qiao had grown much thinner during his illness and had lost much of his presence he'd had as a sect leader. When he wasn't angry or severe, he looked like a frail, harmless, and sickly beauty. Yan Wushi didn't look like someone to be trifled with, but his attitude towards Shen Qiao was careless, and he teased him over and over. It certainly didn't look like he was particularly attached to Shen Qiao, and so one man was inspired to act and went over himself to strike up conversation. Good evening, sir. How should one address you? This one is Zhou Fang, from a merchant family in Longxi. Could he have the pleasure of making your acquaintance? Yan Wushi stayed right where he was, sitting. What is it? He said lazily. In Longxi, Zhou Fang was reckoned a wealthy man. He was a bit displeased when Yan Wushi gave him neither his name nor his attention. Is this one your favorite? He asked. I'm willing to purchase him for 20 gold if your distinguished self is willing to part with him. Yan Wushi laughed sharply and turned to Shen Qiao. Look, Ah Qiao, you don't need to toil in the Jianghu. Your face is enough to earn us money. After I sell you to him, I'll find a chance to steal you back and escape. Then we'll look for another buyer. In a month, we'll be luxuriating in a huge house with beautiful servants in Chang'an. Sorry, you guys. Shen Qiao was already used to Yan Wushi's nonsense and didn't bother with him. Instead, he said to Zhou Fang, Zhou Langjun is mistaken. I'm not a kept man. The moment he opened his mouth, the atmosphere around him shifted as his presence naturally emerged, slow and sedate, like the wind through a forest. From his tone alone, Zhou Fang knew that he'd truly made a huge miscalculation. There was no way someone like this could ever become a kept man. That was rude of me. I ask you not to take it to heart, Zhou Fang replied a little awkwardly. May I ask for this gentleman's esteemed name, so I can have the honor of making your acquaintance? This one is Shen Qiao. Qiao, as in tall trees rise in the south? Qiao, as in the 100 gods does he placate, the peaks and rivers all come partake. Zhou Fang made a sound of understanding, then offered an embarrassed smile. That's rather uncommon. We could call today an example of a friendship forged in the fire of conflict. This Zhou asks Shen Langjun to forgive him for his rudeness. I'll come by another time to make a formal apology at your residence. Shen Qiao smiled. Zhou Langjun is too polite. It's not necessary to come by. My eyesight is lacking, so I'm afraid I'll be a poor host to any guest. If we chance to meet again in the future, I will treat Zhou Langjun to a cup of wine. Zhou Fang couldn't argue with Shen Qiao after that. He cupped his hands and spoke a few polite words, then took his leave and departed. Yan Wushi watched on, greatly amused, not intervening even once. Only after Zhou Fang left did he say, smiling, Ah Qiao, You're not cute at all. We were so close to getting 20 gold, and it just sprouted wings and flew away. He said things like this at least 9 or 10 times a day. Shen Qiao had long ago gotten used to them and turned a deaf ear. He was about to get up and return to his room, but Yan Wushi stopped him. It's early spring, so flowers are blooming at the outskirts of town. Let's take a look before going back. Yan Wushi usually wasn't asking for suggestions when he opened his mouth. He was stating his decision. At present, Shen Qiao was inferior to him in martial arts, but that didn't mean he had no freedom in their interactions. He shook his head at Yan Wushi's comment and said, "No, Sect Leader Yan should go on ahead himself. I'll return to my room." But Yan Wushi grabbed him by the wrist, preventing him from leaving. "You're in your room all day long, doing absolutely nothing. This venerable one is being considerate by taking you out for a break." Shen Qiao only stared silently in reply. He did stay in his room all day, but he wasn't doing nothing. If he wasn't meditating and cultivating, then he was mulling over the Juyang strategy. So these days, as his body slowly recovered, his martial arts were also gradually coming back. By now, he'd regained almost half of what he had before his injury. The only trouble was that the Juyang strategy was too profound. To this day, he wouldn't dare claim he'd completely comprehended the volume Qifeng had passed on to him. And now he had the volume of diluted thought to contemplate. Outsiders would expect him to be ecstatic over it, this wonderful thing they couldn't even have if they begged. As Shen Qiao pondered it day and night, he became convinced that Tao Hongjing was a great genius. The book's content was abstract and enigmatic. There was no way to understand it within a short time. Since his eyes weren't good anyway, he couldn't walk about in the daytime, so he simply sat in his room and silently pondered. He was still able to glean some truths this way. It was how he entertained himself while sitting idle. But when Yan Wushi wanted to do something, he didn't leave any room to refuse. Shen Qiao was no match for him in a fight, so he let Yan Wushi drag him off. They'd only taken a few steps when a voice came from behind them. "Please wait a moment, Sect Leader Yan." They stopped and looked back. Shen Qiao squinted and studied the speaker carefully. Because he'd been injured so often, his health was volatile, and his eyes fluctuated between good and bad. When they were good, he could make out someone's silhouette. When they were bad, the world was pitch black. Lately, he'd recovered a bit, and in the sunlight, he could tell from the man's clothes that it was the person who'd spoken with such confidence and poise during their meal just now. He'd known who Yan Wushi was right off the bat, so it was obvious he came prepared. Perhaps their presence here was the reason he'd appeared at the mill in the first place. The yellow-robed man approached them step by step, stopped 5 or 6 paces away, then bowed and cupped his hands. "Xie Xiang of Linquan Academy greets Sect Leader Yan." There was another person with him, a little older than Xie Xiang. "Zhang Ziqian of Linquan Academy. I hope Sect Leader Yan is well." Yan Wushi made no comment. His gaze swept over Zhang Ziqian before falling back onto Xie Xiang. "So, you're Ru Yan Kehui's favorite disciple?" "I dare not accept Sect Leader Yan's praise," said Xie Xiang. "But Academy Master Ru Yan is indeed my master." "What gave you the idea I was praising you?" Yan Wushi said curiously. "I had one more thing to say. You're only mediocre." The corner of Xie Xiang's mouth twitched. Shen Qiao and Zhang Ziqian looked on in an awkward silence. Shen Qiao had a good temper, and on an average day, Yan Wushi would needle at him hundreds of times, so he'd grown accustomed to the cutting sarcasm and was numb to it. But still, he sympathized deeply with the young man before him. He'd heard Xie Xiang's name before. He was from Chun Commandery's Xie family and was Lin Chuan Academy's most outstanding disciple of his generation. It was rumored that Ru Yan Kehui was grooming Xie Xiang to be his successor and that he'd never fallen short of his master's expectations. At a young age, he'd already leapt into the top ranks of experts for the new generation. His martial arts had been passed down directly from Ru Yan Kehui himself. It was even rumored that Xie Xiang was on track to surpass his own master when it came to Confucianism. Lin Chuan Academy often hosted debates, inviting students of Confucianism from all over the world. Xie Xiang always dominated first place. He was usually treated with extra politeness on his master's merit alone. But Xie Xiang himself was also outstanding, so he'd never been subjected to this kind of taunting before. If Ruyan Kehui approved of him, then he couldn't be someone impulsive or easily angered. Displeasure flashed over his face for just a moment before he regained his composure. The academy master ordered this Xie to deliver an invite, asking Sect Leader Yan to meet him at Chang'an's Yuhuiyang building on the 5th of May. If Ruyan Kehui wishes to meet me, then he should come to me himself, Yan Wushi sneered. What nonsense is this? He turned to leave, but Xie Xiang said severely, May Xiang have the honor of asking for Sect Leader Yan's martial advice? Yan Wushi smiled faintly. All of a sudden, he pointed at Shen Qiao. Would you believe me if I said you couldn't even beat him? The problem was that Shen Qiao's appearance was too deceiving. Coupled with the intimate behavior Yan Wushi had demonstrated during the meal, even Xie Xiang had misunderstood. He frowned, not even sparing a glance at Shen Qiao. Sect Leader Yan is a great man of his generation. Why lower yourself by insulting me with a kept man? Shen Qiao had moved some distance away, but now Yan Wushi pulled him back. With a saccharine, sweet voice, he said, Ah Qiao, he's slandering you. Are you just going to stand there and take it? Shen Qiao was speechless. Why, when he was just standing there, not saying anything, did he still end up dragged into hot water? Chapter 26. Test. Despite all the trouble, Shen Qiao still would have liked to meet Xie Xiang, even if Yan Wushi hadn't dragged him into this. Just from Xie Xiang's words in the hall, where he'd analyzed the world situation, it was clear he wasn't a mere braggart. A short time ago, this one was deeply enlightened by your wonderful commentary. May we have the honor of asking for more advice? No one disliked being praised. Even if Xie Xiang hadn't formed a good opinion of Shen Qiao, he couldn't very well complain after hearing his kind words. However, he'd wanted to spar with Yan Wushi, to fight the unknown Shen Qiao instead, regardless of whether he won or lost, would be an affront to his dignity. So he coolly said, Thanks for your praise. This Xie still has his master's orders, so he's afraid he cannot spare the time. Yan Wushi's voice was chilly. Didn't you want to fight me? If you can defeat him, I'll fight you. Lin Chuan Academy was a Confucian sect, and Ruyan Kehui stood at the pinnacle of the martial arts world, among the top 3 martial arts masters. As his disciple, Xie Xiang couldn't be too shabby himself. Until recently, Shen Qiao had spent most of his time on Xuandu Mountain and rarely got involved in secular affairs. To put it nicely, he transcended worldly matters. But, to put it uncharitably, Shen Qiao's disregard for the world and its political situation was what first planted the seeds of betrayal at Xuandu Mountain. Now, as he traveled the mundane world, it was inevitable that he came into contact with all sorts of people. He couldn't recover his former prowess in a day, not after he'd lost half his martial arts, and sitting inside his room and pondering to himself wouldn't make it happen any faster. So, although he knew Yan Wushi was trying to stir up trouble, Shen Qiao still tried again. This Shen is untalented, so he would like to ask for Xie Langjuan's guidance. Xie Xiang knew nothing of Shen Qiao's background. Much less did he know that Shen Qiao's title, status, and martial arts were once all on par with his master. No matter how strong his self-restraint, with Yan Wushi's repeated provocation, Xie Xiang's temper flared. Angered, he let out a cold laugh. Fine, I'll give you your guidance. He lunged at Shen Qiao. It wasn't some flippant movement. His fingers were crooked and the attack as quick as lightning. On careful examination, it was an incredibly stunning move, like plum blossoms unfurling or a beauty sprinkling perfume, unfolding in waves, as if 1,000 trees had burst into bloom, vibrant and resplendent. The martial arts of Lin Chuan Academy were simple and unembellished. They followed the principle that true ingenuity was unassuming. In fact, the only martial arts technique they had that relied on complexity and speed and that was capable of dazzling and bewitching the eye was what Xie used now, destroying gold and fracturing jade. This was the technique Xie was famous for in the Jianghu. Xie was sure his strike would land, and he didn't intend for it to be a heavy blow. He only wanted to break Shen Qiao's arm so he wouldn't act so full of himself. But just as his fingertips were about to brush Shen Qiao's robe, he was left with a handful of empty air. He made a sound of surprise, then shifted his feet forward and lashed out again. More empty air. His two moves were consummately skilled. Even if Shen Qiao had evaded the first by blind luck, he shouldn't have escaped the second by the same coincidence. Xie wasn't a fool. He realized that Shen Qiao wasn't the weak pushover he appeared to be. This one wasn't going to fall over with a single touch. He grew serious and even drew out his weapon. It was a jade ruler. Jade, but of extremely rare quality. Even brighter than red jade, it was so lustrous that it looked on the brink of dripping blood. If he funneled true qi into this jade ruler and struck someone with it, even their bones would break. But Xie was at an impasse. His red ruler didn't hit Shen Qiao. In fact, it couldn't even get close to him. Every time it was about to touch him, an invisible burst of true qi would arrive, sweeping the ruler away. Xie was completely focused on vindicating himself. The ruler began to overflow with a dusky light. Wherever that light touched, violent storms seemed to follow, whistling as they pelted down on Shen Qiao. Silver arcs shattered the sky, and iron slashes rented apart the ground. The wind swept up by the slashes of the ruler wrapped tightly around Shen Qiao, but they couldn't grasp him directly, only whirl around him a hand's breadth away. Xie was shocked. He thought he'd had an idea of Shen Qiao's strength after watching him dodge his first two moves. He didn't expect that reality would so far exceed his expectations. Shen Qiao didn't try to see with his blurry eyesight. Instead, he simply closed his eyes and listened. Xie sprang gracefully forward and used his ruler to smash through the true qi around Shen Qiao, then leapt into the air and slashed downwards. Shen Qiao's bamboo cane lifted up too, just in time to block the jade ruler. When the two weapons met, the bamboo cane held fast. In no time at all, the two of them exchanged dozens of blows. Zhang Ziqian hadn't taken the fight seriously at first, but now he was starting to worry for his Shirdi despite himself. As he watched the two exchange blows, he held his breath, afraid to make a single sound lest he throw Xie off. He did his best to be absolutely quiet, not even blink. In contrast, Yan Wushi was completely at ease, standing there relaxed with his hands clasped behind him, pleasure written all over his face. He looked like he was enjoying the show. Lin Chuan Academy's martial arts emphasized remaining composed and gracious at all times. But the more Xie fought, the more vicious his attacks became and the more relentlessly he struck. Even if he'd suffered the occasional setback in the Jianghu, all his opponents had been seniors and experts, some of them even grandmasters who ranked in the top 10. Those weren't shameful losses, but the man in front of him wasn't just a nobody. He was a blind nobody. Xie couldn't accept the draw, and definitely not a loss. Both of them were being very cautious. Though they were facing each other in a busy street, they deliberately kept the circle of fighting small. Xie might have been a bit arrogant, but he wasn't so unscrupulous as to involve the innocent. But after a few hundred moves, as his true qi dissipated, Shen Qiao began to feel like he couldn't keep up. He knew he'd be at more and more of a disadvantage if this dragged on. He slammed the bamboo cane into the ground forcefully, using it to spring upwards, his sleeves unfurled, and like an immortal descending after soaring to the heavens, he dropped down while aiming a palm strike at his opponent. Xiaxiang followed right after him, striking up with his own palm as he swung his jade ruler in the other hand, aiming directly for Shen Qiao. Their palms met in midair, their bodies reverberated with the shock of impact. Then, simultaneously, they withdrew their true qi and drifted to the ground. Zhang Ziqian saw Xiexiang's pale and bloodless face and quickly rushed over to ask after him, Shirdi, are you all right? Holding his chest, Xiexiang frowned and slowly shook his head. When he looked at Shen Qiao again, his expression was completely different from before. It's my fault for underestimating him. Xie Langjun is too modest, said Shen Qiao. I was wounded too. This world has many crouching tigers and hidden dragons, and there are experts concealed in every corner, Xie Xiang said, listless. I was too full of myself. I shouldn't have spoken so arrogantly. He ventured another glance at Yan Wushi. Sect leader Yan was right. If I can't even defeat one of your people, how could I be qualified to duel you? After saying so, he cupped his hands in obeisance, then turned and left without a second look at Shen Qiao. Zhang Ziqian tried to call after him, but Xie Xiang didn't turn back, so instead he took off chasing him down the road. A few steps later, something seemed to occur to him. He stopped and turned and cupped his hands politely at Shen Qiao, smiling in apology. Then he was off again, chasing after his Shirdi. Shen Qiao's complexion wasn't looking that good either. Xie Xiang was Ruyan Kehui's favorite disciple, the future leader of Linquan Academy. He wasn't good enough for the top 10 yet, but he wasn't far off. Shen Qiao had fought him at half strength and in poor health. Bringing the match to a draw had cost him dearly. While Xie Xiang's true qi had only been slightly disturbed, Shen Qiao coughed up a mouthful of blood. Beside him, Yan Wushi sighed. Looks like we won't be seeing the flowers today. As he talked, he picked Shen Qiao up by the waist and walked towards the inn. Shen Qiao struggled and frowned. Sect leader Yan, I can walk by myself. Keep moving around, said Yan Wushi, and I'll feed you via lip cup once we get back. Shen Qiao kept his mouth shut. Sometimes he really felt that Yan Wushi was better suited to being a hoodlum or thug rather than a sect leader. Shen Qiao was used to injuries. He'd received one after the other, after all. Once they got back, he fell into another sleep. When he awoke, it was already pitch black outside. The faint, warm fragrance of plum blossoms wafted inside the room. The candlelight wavered, and Yan Wushi was nowhere to be found. He felt around and sat up, put on his shoes, and got off the cot. Heading to the outer room, he rang the bell. He did this entire set of movements with deep familiarity. Anyone not watching closely would never know something was wrong with his eyes. The sound of knocking swiftly came from outside the room. After he'd received Shen Qiao's permission, the concierge pushed the door open and smiled attentively. What order does this gentleman have? What time is it? Asked Shen Qiao. It's about 6:30 in the evening. Is there any food left in the kitchen? Yes, of course. What would your honored self like? Just give this lowly one the word. The stove is still on, so we can cook at any time. Then please bring me a bowl of white congee and a few side dishes. The concierge gave his confirmation, then seeing that he had no other orders, made to leave. But Shen Qiao stopped him. If it's possible to cook something more complicated, please also bring me a bowl of cat ears and the plate of marinated beef. This gentleman is too polite. Whatever the guest needs, our inn is prepared to provide for them all year round. This lowly one will have it made and sent here. Please wait a moment. Shen Qiao nodded. Thank you for your trouble. All the dishes were easy to make. Marinated beef was a cold dish and had been prepared long beforehand. It was ready after some slicing. Freshly kneaded dough was shaped into cat ears, then placed in a pot and the congee and side dishes were even simpler. Within half an hour, they brought all the food to the room. Shunchao picked up the white congee and sipped it slowly. He'd only drunk a few mouthfuls when the door opened. There was no need for him to squint at the newcomer. He could tell who it was simply by the sound of their footsteps. It was a crisp and cold night. Chilled air blew around Yan Wushi as he walked. He came and sat down at the table. Throughout our whole journey, your food was simple. Clear congee and small dishes were enough for you. Could it be that these cat ears and marinated beef were prepared for me? Shen Chao's only response was a smile. He had indeed anticipated that Yan Wushi would return soon, so he'd ordered 2 additional dishes. Yan Wushi prodded him. You and I only became acquainted by chance, like enemies and friends both, and yet you're so attentive down to these finest details. I'll bet you were even more considerate and gentle toward that Yushudi of yours, weren't you? Shen Chao put down his bowl and forced a smile. Bringing up the most sensitive topics, sect leader Yan truly is proficient when it comes to picking others' scabs. I took you for a bronze or iron wall, ignorant and impenetrable, able to remain the same no matter how badly you were betrayed. Shen Chao knew that Yan Wushi was going to start on his philosophy of human nature being evil again, so he simply closed his mouth and spoke no more. But Yan Wushi seemed to find it amusing that Shen Chao had prepared him an evening snack. He changed the topic and said, all smiles, Ah, Chao is so tender and attentive. If you ever find someone to love, I'm certain you'd be even more caring. Anyone lucky enough to be loved by you must have spent dozens of lifetimes cultivating their good fortune. His use of Ah Chao jolted through Shen Chao like lightning, leaving him numb. He had to say, Please don't joke around, sect leader Yan. The moment I became a Taoist, I resolved to stay unmarried for the rest of my life. Yan Wushi chuckled and reached out to pet his hair. Don't you Taoist sects have the concept of Taoist partners? If 2 people become Taoist partners, they won't need to bother with those secular rituals. Plus, you can't return to Xuandu Mountain now anyway, so why not come with me to Huanyue sect? If you're unwilling to be my disciple, I'll give you a different title. Shen Chao's hair stood on end as he listened, and his expression pinched. Given that Yan Wushi always acted on impulse, that he completely disregarded conventional etiquette, and that he often handled matters in wildly unexpected ways, Shen Chao couldn't be sure whether he was speaking sincerely or not. He wrinkled his brow and said, Though sect leader Yan shows great generosity. The instant he said the words great generosity, Yan Wushi let out a single mocking laugh. Shen Chao immediately shut his mouth. Yan Wushi couldn't hold it in anymore. He finally burst into uproarious laughter. He even clutched his stomach and collapsed against the table, all while mocking Shen Chao ruthlessly. Laughing on a full belly is like dessert after a meal, with Ah Chow as seasoning. It's truly too much for me to take. By this point, Shen Chao had of course realized that he'd been made a fool of once again. He pressed his lips firmly together and closed his eyes. No matter what Yan Wushi said, he refused to speak a single word more. All right, everyone. So that concludes the reading of chapters 23 through 26. I'm still laughing. I thoroughly enjoyed these chapters. I feel like I say that every time, but I just really enjoyed these. I love seeing like the banter between Shen Chao and Yan Wushi, and Shen Chao just being like, okay, I'm already used to your antics now, so let's just stop. But like Yan Wushi constantly picking at him to see how he can get on Shen Chao's nerves. I wanted to go specifically to page 253, when Shen Chao was basically saying to Yan Wushi that he would go, on a journey to, I think, Northern Zhou with him because he wanted to learn more about the world and he felt like it would be a blessing for him to travel. And that just got me thinking about the whole UI thing. Like, it really just showed me how much UI does not understand Shun Xiao. Don't get me wrong, he's been placed in circumstances that has like forced him to see the world differently or not see the world differently. But I have no doubt that if UI would have went to Shun Xiao and like just had a true meaningful discussion with him, even if it took like several discussions with Shun Xiao to get him to like go out one day into the world and like go to an area that wasn't the best, that he would be able to see like the state the world was in and realize that his way of living on Shendu Mountain in seclusion and everything and keeping them unattached from the secular world. I think that eventually Shun Xiao would have been able to see that because he's been so open about it during his journey now and has even seen the flaws in his own thinking. So I'm sorry for all of that. That little spurt. But anyway, I love these chapters, and even though Shen Chao like still doesn't like this man, I do like the moments that are mentioned where it's like there's still some chemistry there, even though, you know, one of them is an ass and the other of them is not an ass. But like on page 250, the end of 250 to 251, when it's basically like Shen Qiao, it's not clear if he could avoid Yan Wusher's touch or he didn't avoid his touch. The author put that there for a reason. So, okay. Anyway, I will see you all next time. Sorry for my babble. You didn't have to listen to this part, but if you did, you're a real trooper. I'll see you guys next time.